There's a certain pitch to a tornado siren that cuts through everything, conversations, television, even thought. It's not just a sound, it's a memory for me. A flash of sheet metal flying like paper, screams muffled by wind, the scent of pine trees ripped from the earth. I've lived through it once already, and I made a promise to myself back then, never again. I'm Hank Myers, 54. I spent nearly 3 decades as a structural safety engineer, mostly consulting on disaster resilience for municipal buildings. You name it, schools, storm shelters, hospitals. I was there combing through rebar plans and drainage blueprints. I know what holds, what buckles, and more importantly, what gets people killed. When I retired, I didn't think I'd be fighting these same battles in my own neighborhood. 3 years ago, I bought a modest single-story home in Maple Hollow, a tidy suburban development just outside Tulsa. The homes were neat with vinyl siding and decorative stone trim. It looked like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened until you paid attention. Maple Hollow had an active HOA. Not just active, obsessive. We're talking monthly drone flyovers, a 3-color palette for outdoor furniture, and fines for leaving your garbage can visible for more than 30 minutes after pickup. Their architectural control committee operated like a Cold War surveillance agency with lawn rulers and clipboard patrols. And the president, Carol Whitmore, ran it like a kingdom she inherited from God herself. When I moved in, I didn't cause any waves. I minded my business, said hello, waved when I mowed the lawn. But after that first summer, when I saw the HOA newsletter warning people not to install storm shelters because they were visually disruptive to the neighborhood character, something in me twitched. That's not just short-sighted. That's homicidal. I sent a polite email to the board citing Oklahoma storm shelter ordinances and FEMA recommendations. I even offered to host a free community seminar on basic wind mitigation. Never heard back. So I did what I always do. I prepared. Quietly. I reinforced my attic trusses, replaced my windows with wind-rated glass, installed a discreet ground-level storm shelter with full ventilation and radio communication lines. None of it was visible from the curb. All of it was legal. But that didn't stop Carol from noticing. Her first visit to my property came one afternoon in early spring, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a line so tight it looked painted on. I was pruning my crepe myrtle when I saw her marching up the driveway. "Mr. Myers," she said, not even glancing at the bush, "you've modified your property without HOA approval." "Good afternoon to you too, Carol," I replied calmly. "And no, I haven't. Everything I've installed is compliant with both municipal codes and your own HOA guidelines. Page 12, Section 4, Paragraph 3. No structural changes visible from the street without approval." She blinked briefly, disarmed, but then she regrouped. "We've received concerns about your antenna," she said, pointing at the narrow whip aerial mounted to the side of my home. "That's a NEOA certified emergency radio. Not for TV, not for fun. It's a passive receiver and legal under both FCC and HOA regulations." Again, page 8. "I'll have to look into that," she said stiffly, scribbling something onto her clipboard, though I knew damn well she hadn't written a thing. That was our first run-in. It would not be the last. The following week, I received a violation notice in the mail for non-aesthetic modifications and was instructed to remove the antenna or face daily fines. I appealed immediately and included photo evidence, documentation, and city permit numbers. They ignored it. Still, I left the antenna up. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel her eyes on my house. I heard from a neighbor that Carol called me the bunker guy, said I was trying to stir panic. I wasn't trying to stir anything. I was trying to be ready. That summer was dry, long, and hot. Tornado season came early. The skies over Oklahoma took on that ominous amber tint I knew too well, and local weather stations began tracking unstable systems in the plains. I started testing my shelter weekly. Checked the filters, stocked food and water. I even bought a small collapsible stretcher just in case a neighbor needed help. But around here, nobody wanted to hear about it. Denial was easier. The HOA newsletter that May featured an article titled "Storm Preparedness Without the Hysteria," in which Carol herself warned residents against overreacting to media-fueled weather drama and cluttering their properties with unsightly protective equipment. She wasn't just negligent, she was dangerous. Still, I kept to myself, but inside I could feel it building, that low hum in the gut that told me something was coming. Not just a storm, but a reckoning. I began documenting everything. Every notice, every warning ignored. I took photos of common areas with blocked drains, poorly secured playground equipment, and the community clubhouse, an aging prefab structure, without a storm-safe foundation. One afternoon, I watched a contractor remove the reinforced bolts from a neighbor's porch swing anchor because the HOA doesn't allow visible anchors. The man shrugged when I asked him if he knew the risk during high winds, just doing what the board says he said. That's when I knew. If a tornado ever hit this place, we were in trouble. What no one seemed to realize was that aesthetics don't survive 200-mile-per-hour winds. Vinyl siding won't save your children. A pretty lawn won't keep your roof on. But code compliance just might. I couldn't save everyone, but I could be ready when it came, and I could make damn sure that when it all fell apart, I'd have the receipts. The sirens hadn't sounded yet, but I could already hear them. The violation notice arrived folded in thirds like a corporate love letter. Cream-colored paper, Maple Hollow HOA letterhead, and that nauseating cursive logo at the top that always looked like it belonged on a boutique perfume brand, not a governing body. I didn't even have to open it to know what it was. By then, I could smell a fine through the envelope. Notice of non-compliance, code B3.42. Unauthorized exterior modifications, the storm shutters. I had installed them 3 days prior. Heavy-duty powder-coated aluminum with hurricane-rated locking pins and sealant gaskets. Not the kind you slap up in panic, these were built in subtle painted to match my trim, designed to withstand more than just wind, debris, pressure shifts, flying objects traveling over 100 miles per hour. All things I had seen before. Things Carol Whitmore had clearly never studied in her pursuit of front porch symmetry. The notice said I had 7 days to remove them, or face a $50 daily fine backdated to the day of installation. I laughed. Not a real laugh. The kind that comes from the part of you that used to care, but now just simmers. I walked out front with a cup of black coffee in one hand and the notice in the other. I stared at my shutters clean aligned, hardly noticeable, unless you were actively trying to enforce power over someone, which is exactly what this was. Just then, my neighbor Tom Delgado shuffled down the sidewalk in his tennis whites, waving politely. "Hey, Hank," he called. "Trouble again, storm shutters," I said, raising the envelope. Apparently, they clash with the neighborhood's colonial purity. He chuckled nervously and came closer. "I was going to ask you where you got them, actually. Looked them up online, but wasn't sure which kind held up to debris strikes." I paused. "You thinking about installing?" He hesitated. "I am. My wife, Natalie, she gets real nervous when tornado season hits. But Carol said we needed to submit full architectural diagrams and wait for board approval. Said it might take a month." I sighed and rubbed my jaw. "You don't have a month." He shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, I know." I handed him a printout I kept in my pocket folder, FEMA's latest recommendations for residential wind protection. "You didn't get this from me," I said. He took it, nodded, and walked on. A man who knew what was coming but still tethered to the illusion of peace through compliance. The next morning, Carol herself appeared again, this time flanked by a clipboard-carrying assistant named Mallory Young, overconfident and clearly enjoying her newfound role in neighborhood governance. They didn't knock. They just stood there like missionaries of beige uniformity. "We're escalating your file," Carol said bluntly, offering no greeting. I kept my hand on the doorframe. "To whom the HOA tribunal in Geneva?" She didn't smile. "You are undermining neighborhood cohesion. Your modifications give the impression that Maple Hollow is under threat. That creates panic. It is under threat," I replied. "It's called a tornado. You know, those fast-moving air columns that flatten communities and don't care what color your mailbox is?" Mallory cleared her throat as if rehearsing for a courtroom drama. "You were informed that any visible storm protection measures require advance approval." "They're not visible from the curb," I said flatly. Carol leaned forward. "We received complaints. Several." I glanced over her shoulder and saw Ms. Price, 3 houses down, quickly duck behind her curtain. "Of course," "Remove them," Carol snapped, "or we'll begin legal proceedings." I stared at her, saying nothing. Silence has weight. It's a thing people like Carol aren't used to carrying. Then I closed the door, not slammed, just closed it. Inside, I turned back to my desk. Laid out on it were plans for the community clubhouse, copies of inspection reports I'd pulled from the city database, and an unfiled incident report from 2 years ago about an HVAC fire that had nearly gone unreported because Carol had bribed a city inspector to sign off on a rushed repair. I wasn't just preparing for wind. I was preparing for the storm after the storm. I opened my email and drafted a short message to the local news affiliate I used to consult for during my career. The subject line, "Negligence in plain sight." I didn't hit send yet, not yet, but the draft sat there, waiting. Later that week, I attended the HOA meeting in the clubhouse, if only to record it. My phone was in my shirt pocket, already running. Carol opened the meeting with her usual smugness, flanked by Mallory and another board member, Greg, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The agenda listed 10 items, and mine, unauthorized emergency preparations, was number 7. When they got to it, Carol stood. "Mr. Myers has modified his property in defiance of established aesthetic guidelines and has refused to comply with formal notices. This is not just about shutters or antennas. It's about the precedent this sets. If we allow unapproved modifications, we lose the unified vision that makes Maple Hollow desirable." I raised my hand. Carol paused, then gave a tight nod. Respectfully, I began, "You're prioritizing visual uniformity over human safety. These aren't lawn gnomes. These are life-saving devices installed with code-compliant materials and within municipal regulations. If your vision of community excludes survival, then it's not a community. It's a facade." A murmur rolled through the dozen or so attendees. Most were elderly or busy parents, people who didn't want drama, just peace and predictability. But I saw something shift in a few eyes. Tom, for one, looked down at his lap, clearly uncomfortable. Carol tried to respond, but I cut her off. "And let me remind you all," I said, raising my voice slightly, "that the clubhouse we're standing in right now has never passed a Category EF2 wind inspection. The roof joists are untreated, and the emergency exits are non-compliant with city code. If a tornado hit during an event here, this place would become a tomb." That got silence. Cold, thick silence. I stood slowly, gathered my papers, and nodded toward the door. "I'm not the problem," I said. "The weather is. Pretending it won't come won't save you." And then I left. That night, the wind picked up. I stood on my porch watching the clouds roll like black smoke over the horizon. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Somewhere in the distance, a siren test echoed into the dark. Carol still hadn't listened, but the sky would. And it never asked for permission. 2 days passed after the HOA meeting, and I didn't hear a word from Carol. No new fines, no visits, no passive-aggressive flyers slipped under my door. At first, I thought maybe I'd struck a nerve, that perhaps my comments had jolted something inside her, forced a crack in the porcelain shell of HOA perfectionism she wore like armor. I was wrong. What I mistook for silence was simply the breath before the storm. Carol Whitmore wasn't defeated. She was plotting. It began with the garbage can. Thursday morning, I rolled it out to the curb just like I had every week for the past 3 years. Collection was scheduled for 8:30 a.m. I brought it out at 7:45. The violation notice was taped to my garage door by 8:15. Refuse container placed more than 30 minutes prior to designated collection time. Violation of code F1.2. I blinked at it. No one had ever enforced that rule before. I checked my security camera footage later. Carol herself had crept up the driveway in tennis shoes, slapped the notice on the door, and walked away without knocking. The following week, I received another citation for unapproved exterior color variation. This time, it was my back patio furniture steel frame chairs in charcoal gray. Not visible from the street, barely visible from my neighbor's upstairs window. But apparently still worthy of HOA attention. It didn't stop there. A drone began hovering over my yard in the late afternoons. I suspected it belonged to Mallory. Her boyfriend was a tech nut, and they lived 2 houses down. I never saw it land, never saw anyone flying it, but it always showed up between 4:00 and 4:15 p.m., low and deliberate, as if searching for contraband. At first, I ignored it. Then I stood in my yard with a baseball cap pulled low and waved. It zipped off instantly, like a deer catching scent of something dangerous. That weekend, I got my first ever grass violation, inconsistent lawn coloration. It read, citing a dry patch the size of a bath towel near my sprinkler head. We were in early drought watch. The city had already reduced watering schedules. But logic wasn't the point. Harassment was. I began keeping a log. Date, time, violation, source. I installed a second camera facing the front path and bought a pocket audio recorder I kept clipped inside my shirt whenever I went outside. I knew better than to confront Carol directly. No, this wasn't a battle to be won in shouting matches. I was going to win with evidence layered, indisputable, time to the minute. Still, the pressure grated on me. One night, as I tried to unwind with a movie and a neat glass of whiskey, the screen door rattled. I walked out expecting wind, but there was none. Instead, I found another envelope. No stamp, no HOA letterhead. Just plain white slipped between the screen and the frame. Inside a printout of the HOA codebook with one phrase highlighted in yellow. All modifications deemed visually disruptive or non-conforming to the harmonious appearance of the neighborhood may be subject to removal or fine. No signature, no note, just that one sentence. Carol wasn't just targeting me through fines anymore. She was escalating, testing the limits of intimidation. It worked briefly. That night, I dreamed of the last time I ignored my gut. March 3rd, 2002, a high school in southeastern Missouri. I'd flagged the gymnasium roof as non-compliant for wind uplift resistance. Nobody listened. That spring, an EF3 tore the building apart during a Saturday basketball game. 4 students were killed, one of them, the janitor's son. He died clutching a metal bleacher rail in a pile of twisted roof panels. I was the one who had to help identify the body. I woke in a sweat lungs aching and sat on the edge of the bed until sunrise. That morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I started with a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act. I sent it to the city permitting office, asking for all documentation related to Maple Hollow HOA's building modifications, drainage approvals, and structural inspections over the past 5 years. I had a friend named Brenda there, used to be a field inspector, before retiring to desk work. She texted me 2 days later, "Some interesting things in here. Want to come in and take a look?" I did. Buried among the routine filings were 2 red flags. One, the community clubhouse had never received its final wind resilience sign-off. 2, the retention pond overflow system designed to handle excessive stormwater runoff had been modified without permit just last year. Someone had submitted new plans, then ignored them. The HOA had paved a new walking trail that ran right over the primary drainage easement. If water ever backed up, it would pool at the lowest point, which according to the topographic map was 5 homes on the east side of the subdivision, including mine. I took copies, signed for them, drove home with a strange clarity rising in my chest. It wasn't paranoia, it was math. Back in my garage, I unrolled the master plat map of Maple Hollow that I'd bought at closing. I marked the blocked drainage route in red, marked the clubhouse's weak structural points in blue. The whole place was a cocktail of negligence waiting to be shaken. I taped the map to the back of my office door and stared at it for a long time. Carol's obsession with control wasn't just about power, it was about image. Maple Hollow had been featured in a regional real estate article the year before the safe, stylish suburb of tomorrow. She wanted to be known as the steward of that vision, and I was a crack in her mirror. She couldn't afford to ignore me forever, so she doubled down. The next week, while I was at the hardware store buying replacement battery packs for my emergency gear, I came home to find a city code enforcement officer waiting in my driveway. A younger guy, maybe 30, sweating through his collar and looking uncomfortable. "You Mr. Myers?" he asked. "Depends," I said. "Am I being fined or arrested?" He gave a weak smile and held up a clipboard. We received an anonymous complaint about unpermitted structural modifications on your property. I'm here to verify. Come on in, I said. He inspected the storm shutters, nodded, took photos. I showed him the shelter access. He crouched, checked the ventilation, even complimented the grounding. This is cleaner than most commercial-grade setups I've seen, he muttered. Everything's permitted and legal, I said. And HOA doesn't supersede city code. He sighed. Yeah, I know. But anonymous complaints we have to follow up. As he left, I handed him a folder with copies of the HOA's own violations. He flipped through the first few pages and raised an eyebrow. I'll pass this along, he said. Carol had just overplayed her hand. If she wanted to turn this into a war, I was finally ready. The sky cracked open at 2:37 a.m., not with rain or wind. Not yet. Just a sound. A low vibrating moan that started somewhere beyond the horizon, deep and wide like the groan of steel under pressure. I sat bolt upright in bed, heart racing. That sound didn't come from the earth. It came from the air. By the time I made it to the kitchen, the NOAA radio had lit up like a Christmas tree, flashing red. The voice that came through was calm, but clipped, the kind of calm you only hear when something very bad is about to happen. Severe weather alert. Tornado watch upgraded to warning. Rotation confirmed. Tulsa County and surrounding areas. Seek shelter immediately. I stood still, one hand on the counter, the other tightening into a fist. The room felt smaller, heavier. I flicked the hallway light on and moved like a machine. Grabbed my go bag, double-checked the batteries in the flashlight, opened the storm hatch in my living room floor. Everything was ready. But I didn't go down right away. I looked out the window first. The sky had turned that familiar, terrible shade of green. Not the kind of green you find in nature. This was the color of bruised ozone of something wounded and furious. The trees outside barely moved. The air was too still, too tight. I turned to check my phone, expecting to find community alerts, maybe a warning thread on our HOA's app. But when I opened it, nothing. The HOA app had been suspended. At first I thought it was a glitch, but then I saw the email in my inbox, time-stamped just 15 minutes prior. To all Maple Hollow residents. Please disregard unverified reports of severe weather. The HOA board is working directly with local media to ensure clear, accurate communication. Stay calm, stay indoors, do not contribute to community panic. HOA admin. No signature, no emergency number, no evacuation guidance, just denial, dismissal. I stood in disbelief. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from rage. That's when I heard the thunder. Not the usual kind. Not rolling and distant. This was close, sudden. The kind that shakes the inside of your ribs. I pulled open the cabinet and pulled out my walkie tuned to Channel 5, the local emergency responders channel. I used to coordinate with them during inspections years ago, and I still kept it around. Winds above 1 in 10. Structural collapses on rural Route 72. Requesting backup for tree clearing unit. They were already being overwhelmed. I grabbed the backup radio, stuffed it into my vest, and ran outside. The wind hit like a wall. Sharp, wet air pressing from the south. Lightning forked above the neighborhood in violent flashes. I pounded on Tom and Natalie's door. Tom opened, bleary-eyed and barefoot. Get to your shelter, I shouted. Now, it's real. The funnel's coming. He didn't argue, just nodded, pulled his wife into the hallway, and vanished inside. I did the same at the Carlson place across the street, and at the new couple's house next door. I knew who had built below-ground shelters and who hadn't. I skipped Carol's house. She had made her bed. Just as I sprinted back to mine, the power died. Everything snapped dark. Only lightning remained, strobing the neighborhood in fractured apocalyptic bursts. I climbed down into my shelter. The thick door sealed with a heavy metallic clunk, and the storm shut the rest of the world out like a roar into a vacuum. I turned on the emergency radio and listened. The static pulsed, and then, rotation crossing North Tulsa, multiple touchdowns, Maple Hollow vicinity, stay sheltered. I braced against the cold concrete wall and waited. 15 minutes passed like 15 years. The wind screamed. I could hear branches, maybe roofs, being ripped away. One thud against my house above was loud enough to make dust sift from the ceiling of the shelter. It smelled like wet earth and insulation. Then silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind that feels wrong, suspenseful, expectant. When I opened the hatch and climbed up, the air outside had changed. Heavy with ozone, sticky with vapor. But the green was gone, replaced by low bruised clouds and the creeping orange of dawn bleeding over the horizon. My house had held. The shutters were still in place, but I could already hear sirens in the distance, multiple units. I stepped out onto my driveway and saw it. The clubhouse. Half of it was gone. The east-facing wall had collapsed completely. Shingles littered the street like confetti. The side entrance where they'd placed the community gathering point was buried under what looked like a snapped tree and a full panel of siding. Carol had held a neighborhood meeting there just last weekend. I ran toward it, inside chaos. The smell of splintered wood and burnt wire. A pipe had burst somewhere and water trickled across the floor. Mallory was inside sobbing, bleeding from a cut on her forehead. She'd taken shelter in the supply closet, and by some miracle, that section hadn't caved in. I helped her out, gave her my jacket, asked about others. She just shook her head. I heard screaming from behind one of the hall doors. We forced it open, me, another neighbor named Vic, and two teenagers with torn-up pajama pants. The door had jammed when the frame twisted. Inside, two elderly residents had huddled together under folding tables. Both were conscious, terrified, but alive. We pulled them out one by one. My hands were covered in drywall dust, blood, and cold rain. I didn't stop. None of us did. We spent the next hour pulling people from the debris, checking for movement, yelling names, and still, not a single word from Carol. It was only when the fire department arrived, red lights bouncing off the shattered windows and twisted porch railing, that I saw her. She was standing in her driveway, hair soaked and flat against her face, mouth open in a silent scream as she watched them cordon off the street around the clubhouse. She kept pointing at the debris, at her house, at the news van that had arrived out of nowhere. I don't know what she expected them to do. Fix it. Reverse time, I walked past her on my way back home. She grabbed my sleeve. Her fingers were ice. You knew, she hissed. You scared everyone. You planted this. I turned slowly. No, Carol, I said. You ignored every warning. You built that death trap. You did this. She let go. The camera from the news van turned our way. I didn't stop to pose. I went home, washed the blood off my arms, and sat at my desk. The folder with her violations was still there. So I picked up the phone and called Brenda. It's time, I told her. Send the file. By midday, the entire neighborhood smelled like splinters and wet soil. Emergency crews moved through Maple Hollow like ghosts in bright uniforms, their radios crackling over sirens, barking out coordinates and body counts. A few of them recognized me from my consulting days. One nodded grimly as he passed holding a gas-powered saw and a coil of emergency tarp. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The tornado had cut a swath right through the eastern edge of the subdivision. 5 homes reduced to sticks. 2 others gutted like fish, their frames standing naked and defiant. The clubhouse, a symbol of Carol's pristine order, was unrecognizable, half swallowed by the playground's twisted jungle gym. The front awning hung from a single metal bracket, swaying, creaking. And yet, amid all that destruction, my home stood. The shutters had held. The storm shelter had done its job. Not a single window cracked. I wasn't smug about it. I just felt hollow. It could have been worse, much worse. 2 serious injuries, no deaths. But it didn't have to happen at all. Not like this. Not if the HOA had listened. Not if Carol had taken her role as seriously as she took grass height and mailbox fonts. I walked the street like a ghost myself that morning, checking in on neighbors, clearing debris, handing out batteries and clean water. Most people were quiet. Some nodded with soft gratitude. Others couldn't look me in the eye, but they knew. All of them knew. They remembered the HOA emails saying I was sowing fear. They remembered the fines, the warnings, the citations for trying to prepare. They remembered my words at the clubhouse. If a tornado hits during an event here, this place will become a tomb. It nearly had. By late afternoon, the press arrived in full force. The local NBC affiliate ran the story first community storm shelter collapses in Maple Hollow, HOA under fire. Their drone footage was brutal. A slow pan across the splintered playground, broken beams jutting into the air like snapped ribs, emergency responders digging through the wreckage. Then came the national stations, ABC, CNN. Even a Weather Channel van rolled in, parking crooked on the sidewalk across from my house. Someone gave them my name. I was out front duct taping the hinges on my fence when a woman with a mic and a wind-blown ponytail approached. "Mr. Myers, I'm Dana Hall with Channel 7. Do you have a minute to speak about the HOA's response?" I looked up. She wasn't pushy, not yet. But her cameraman already had the lens focused. I didn't plan to say much. But then I saw Carol on the other side of the street, flanked by Mallory, who looked like she'd been crying, and two board members I barely knew. Carol was talking animatedly to a uniformed police officer, pointing again, this time at me. I turned to the reporter. "Sure," I said, "but I won't be brief." They filmed me with my back to the ruined clubhouse. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply laid it out. I've been a structural safety engineer for nearly 30 years. I moved to Maple Hollow for a quiet retirement. What I found was an HOA more concerned with curb appeal than community safety. I installed code-compliant shutters and a legally permitted storm shelter. I was fined, harassed, accused of creating panic. The clubhouse that collapsed was built with untreated joists and never received its final wind certification. They ignored weather alerts. They told residents not to listen to verified warnings. What happened here wasn't just a tornado. It was preventable negligence. When I finished, Dana blinked. The cameraman lowered his rig. "You said never certified. Do you have documents to support that?" she asked. "I do," I said. "Would you like copies?" She nodded. I handed her a flash drive. I had prepared for this moment years ago without even realizing it. By sundown, the HOA had gone into full defensive mode. Carol released a statement on the Maple Hollow website, which for the first time ever was no longer hidden behind a login wall. "We are deeply saddened by the damage and distress caused by this natural disaster. The HOA takes safety seriously and will fully cooperate with all city investigations. We ask residents not to speculate or spread misinformation at this time." It was so carefully worded I could almost hear the HOA's lawyer breathing into her ear while she typed it. But the residents weren't buying it. That night I received over 24 messages from neighbors, former board members, even a couple of city officials. Many apologized. Some sent me photos of their damages. Others offered to testify if needed. One message from Natalie Delgado simply read, "You were right. Thank you for warning us. You saved us." I stared at the screen for a long time. Outside, the wind had calmed, but the real storm had just begun. The next morning, inspectors arrived. Real ones. Not clipboard volunteers. These were city engineers in neon vests with laser measuring tools and clipboards thicker than a Bible. I watched them move from structure to structure, testing soil displacement, scanning foundations, photographing split trusses and warped crossbeams. When they reached the clubhouse, one paused at the corner of the building, what remained of it anyway. He crouched, pulled out a chisel, and gently flaked away a sliver of the beam. Then he looked over at me. "You the homeowner who reported this?" "Yes," I said. He nodded. "Good call." A second inspector joined him, holding a moisture meter and what looked like a forensic clipboard. I overheard a few snippets phrases like unreinforced anchors, non-standard bolts, subcode materials. One of them shook his head and muttered, "That thing would have collapsed in a strong gust, let alone a tornado." I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth had its own weight, now finally acknowledged by someone other than me. Later that day, the city posted a stop work order on the clubhouse site and another one on the HOA's maintenance shed. A temporary emergency order was enacted that stripped the HOA of its authority to issue fines, enforce code, or make architectural decisions pending investigation. Carol's face when she saw the notices was something I'll never forget. She stood in her driveway again, wrapped in a tan shawl, her eyes darting from clipboard to clipboard like she could will it all back to normal if she just disapproved hard enough. But there were no clipboards she could control now, no citations she could write. That afternoon, as the sun finally broke through the clouds for the first time in 2 days, I sat on my porch and sipped lukewarm coffee. Carol marched across the street toward me. No clipboard, no entourage, just her. "You happy now?" "Oh," she asked, voice low and acidic. I looked up. "No," I said honestly, "because this didn't have to happen." Her face twitched. She didn't have a comeback for that. She turned and walked away. I didn't stop her. I just watched the sky. It was blue again, but I knew better. The real storm was still ahead. The first real sign that Maple Hollow had cracked came not from the city or the news, but from the silence. Not a peaceful, relieved kind of silence. This was the heavy, awkward hush that settles in after a collective failure, when everyone knows something has gone horribly wrong, but no one quite knows how to say it aloud. People walked slower, talked in murmurs. Those who used to nod with tight smiles when passing now avoided eye contact altogether. Not because they blamed me, but because they didn't want to face what I represented. The warning. They ignored the disaster they pretended wouldn't happen. Within 48 hours of the tornado, the HOA board's power had all but vanished. The emergency order from the city halted all citations, HOA fee collections, and administrative decisions until a third-party auditor could be appointed. Even the community email server had been temporarily disabled, locked down under subpoena. Carol tried to keep up appearances. She still walked the neighborhood in her pressed beige slacks and linen cardigan's clipboard, swapped for a legal pad phone glued to her ear, but no one followed her. Mallory hadn't been seen since the night of the storm, and Greg, the last remaining board member, had submitted his resignation to the city that morning. I was in my garage helping Vic replace the axle on his emergency generator when the fire marshal stopped by. "Mr. Myers," he said. I wiped my hands and nodded. "That's me." He extended a hand. "Chief Dawson. Heard about you through the structural assessment team. Just wanted to say, you did good." I nodded slowly. "I did what I could." He glanced at the makeshift repair maps taped to my wall. "Word is, you kept several households safer than they would have been without you." I shrugged. "Wasn't enough." He hesitated, then pulled a folded sheet from his clipboard. "Thought you should see this. Internal report. Not public yet. But you'll want to know what we're filing with the city." I unfolded it. The summary read, "The Maple Hollow Community Clubhouse failed due to structural insufficiencies, improper anchoring and non-code materials. Collapse was exacerbated by lack of storm reinforcement measures and blocked drainage routes contributing to water retention and foundation shift. Further down, contributing cause, willful disregard of safety codes by HOA governing board." I stared at the words for a long time. When I looked up, Chief Dawson was watching me carefully. "You were right," he said. "And you were ignored." "Yeah," I replied. "That seems to be the theme lately." He gave a faint sympathetic smile and left me with the paper. I didn't file it away. I taped it right next to the HOA's original citation notice for my shutters. The contrast was poetic. That evening, the neighborhood held a gathering. Not in the clubhouse, of course. What remained of that was still roped off and under city control. Instead, we met on the common green, a patch of open space that hadn't yet been turned into a recreational corridor by Carol's landscaping committee. About 30 residents showed up, some with folding chairs, others with water bottles and flashlights. No one knew who was leading it. It just happened. Tom stood up first. "I think we owe someone an apology," he said, glancing at me. "Hank tried to warn us, not just about the weather, but about the bigger problem." And we ignored him. A few nods. Then Natalie added, "We were scared to rock the boat." But the boat was already sinking. One by one, others spoke. About the citations, the fines, the fear of retaliation, the quiet resentment that had built up under Carol's regime, and how none of it mattered when the sky turned green and the wind tore through their walls like paper. I didn't even know how to open the shelter hatch, someone admitted, because I never bothered to install one. I thought it would ruin the backyard view. I listened. Not smugly, not righteously, just listening. Then someone asked the question we'd all been circling. "So, what now?" There was silence again. But this time it was expectant. I cleared my throat. "Well, first we take care of each other. Until the city clears the HOA to function again, which might take a while, we organize ourselves. volunteer patrols, generator checks, supply sharing. We keep emergency radios tuned. We clear blocked storm drains and map the next shelter plan. Someone whispered, like a neighborhood emergency corps. I nodded. Exactly. No politics, no paperwork, just people helping people. That night, we divided the neighborhood into 5 zones, assigned 2 volunteers per zone, created a group text for alerts. I distributed printed maps I'd prepared years ago and watched with quiet awe as residents who'd once dismissed me now stepped forward with purpose. The next morning, I received an official email from the city's Office of Civil Oversight. They had appointed a temporary neighborhood safety liaison to assist during the transition period. Me. I reread the email 3 times. It wasn't a power grab. It wasn't a title I'd asked for, but they had seen the news, read the reports, and they knew I had the plans, the documentation, the trust, or at least the beginning of it. By noon, I was meeting with the city's code enforcement coordinator and a liaison from FEMA. They wanted to assess Maple Hollow for grant eligibility and begin drafting a community recovery strategy. I brought everything I had: violation files, structural diagrams, community complaints. When the meeting ended, the FEMA rep shook my hand. "You've basically done our work for us," she said. "Impressive." "It shouldn't have taken this," I replied. She nodded solemnly. "No, it shouldn't have." Back home, I found a handwritten note taped to my front door. I was wrong. We all were. Thank you for not giving up. Joyce. I didn't know Joyce personally. Maybe one of the residents who once voted with Carol. Maybe someone who once filed a complaint about my shutters. It didn't matter. The tide had turned. Carol, meanwhile, had gone quiet. Rumor had it she'd lawyered up, that she'd stopped returning calls from other residents, that she was trying to sell her house, though no realtors in town wanted to touch Maple Hollow until the lawsuits were settled. Yes, lawsuits. By the end of the week, at least 3 families had filed claims against the HOA for endangering their lives and property due to gross negligence. And I'd been contacted by a legal advocate from the state who wanted my help in drafting new legislation for HOA oversight. The way you documented this, she said, could help reshape enforcement guidelines for the entire county. I didn't seek revenge. I sought resolution. But I knew this: every piece of paper I filed, every map I marked, every warning I logged was now a stepping stone out of the wreckage. We weren't just rebuilding homes. We were rebuilding trust. The news crews hadn't left. If anything, their presence had multiplied. By the end of the week, Maple Hollow had become a microcosm for every frustrated homeowner across the state who'd ever suffered under the pettiness and unchecked control of a rogue HOA. Reporters roamed the sidewalks interviewing families in front of their shattered porches, capturing wide shots of tarped roofs and emergency notices taped to shattered windows. The media loved a good villain, and they had found one in Carol Whitmore. But the real shift didn't happen on TV. It happened on clipboards. The city inspectors returned with specialists in tow, stormwater engineers, structural code examiners, even a team from the Department of Emergency Management. They weren't just assessing damage anymore. They were building a case. I watched from my porch as one inspector knelt beside the remnants of the walking trail that Carol had insisted be paved over the drainage easement. He pulled a thin metal probe from his bag and jabbed it into the soil. Waterlogged to a depth of 15 inches, he said aloud to his partner, with no subsurface filtration path. His partner shook her head. "This whole area is compromised. No wonder that slope collapsed. They didn't need me to say anything anymore. The earth was speaking loud enough for everyone." Later that day, I walked them through my files again. This time in my kitchen, where I'd cleared a long oak table for maps, reports, and the thick binder I'd come to call my HOA Bible. Page after page of documented violations, emails, and photographs I'd taken during my quiet war with Carol. The lead investigator, a meticulous woman named Stephanie Lowell, scanned through each document with the focus of a surgeon. "You know," she said, eventually tapping a postmarked violation letter from 3 months ago, "most people don't think to document harassment this well." "I wasn't trying to prove harassment," I replied. "I was trying to protect lives. I just didn't think it would take a disaster to be heard." She nodded, not sympathetically, but respectfully. By the time they left, she took the binder with her. We'll be submitting this as part of the formal report to the City Council, she said, and likely to the Attorney General's office as well. That evening, I saw the first cracks appear in Carol's composure. She came storming down the sidewalk around 6:00 p.m., mascara smeared under her eyes like war paint, holding a phone in one hand and a folder in the other. She was mid-rant, her voice carrying across the quiet street like a siren. They are twisting everything, she shouted, pacing in front of the demolished clubhouse. This is slander. They're blaming me for a tornado. No one responded. No one was around to hear it save for me leaning on my porch railing and watching with silent detachment. They didn't follow proper procedures. The board voted I have minutes, she shrieked into her phone. Moments later, a camera crew appeared from around the corner, local news channel 5. The one I hadn't spoken to yet. They caught her mid-meltdown. Her face flushed, voice raised, hands gesturing wildly at the collapsed building behind her, like she could shift blame with enough finger pointing. The reporter didn't interrupt, just filmed, took it all in. I couldn't help but feel sorry for her for a second. But only for a second. Because I remembered what it had felt like months earlier to be publicly humiliated over shutters that saved my life. I remembered the citations, the drones, the fear instilled in every resident who dared install a generator or talk about disaster prep. Carol had been queen of a hollow castle, and now the wind had stripped it bare. 2 days later, the video aired. It wasn't edited kindly. They juxtaposed her rant with cutaways to the inspector's report, to the sobbing interview of an elderly couple who'd been trapped inside the clubhouse, and to my calm explanation of the structural failings. Then they played the part where Carol, voice shaking, screamed, "I did nothing wrong. I kept this place beautiful." The comments online were brutal. One viewer wrote, "This is why HOAs need oversight. Beautiful won't save you in a storm." Another, "Kudos to the retired engineer who documented everything. Total legend. I didn't respond, but I read every word." The story went statewide. Then national, NBC Nightly News picked it up. CNN ran a segment called HOA Power Out of Control. I received a message from a producer with a weather podcast asking if I'd speak about code versus cosmetic priorities in suburban America. But I wasn't interested in becoming a hero. I was interested in finishing the job. That's when Stephanie Lowell called again. "We've concluded our preliminary findings," she said. "The evidence is overwhelming. The HOA board, particularly Ms. Whitmore, acted in sustained violation of city codes, failed to comply with basic structural safety laws, and obstructed emergency communication channels." I waited silent. She continued. "The city is recommending the dissolution of the current HOA board pending legal proceedings. We're also encouraging that Maple Hollow be placed under temporary municipal oversight." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means your HOA is finished for now, and Carol will likely be facing civil penalties, maybe worse." I didn't cheer, I didn't smile, I just exhaled. That evening, the city posted notices on the bulletin boards throughout the neighborhood. Emergency notice, HOA suspension in effect. Beneath it was a smaller sheet of paper listing names. Mine was at the top, labeled Community Safety Liaison, Hank Myers. I walked the neighborhood that night, clipboard in hand, not out of spite, not to enforce, but to check in. House by house. Natalie and Tom were still shaken but recovering. The Carlsons were living with relatives until their house could be stabilized. The Vasquez family had lost a shed, but their main structure was intact. Each person thanked me. Each person lingered longer in conversation than they ever had before. By the time I circled back to my house, I saw someone standing near the wreckage of the clubhouse. Alone. Carol. She didn't speak when I approached, just stared at the mess like it would somehow resolve itself if she kept staring long enough. When she finally looked at me, her face was different. No fury, just emptiness. "I love this place," she whispered. I nodded. "I believe you did." She glanced down. "Why didn't you just push harder?" "Force people to listen, because I've learned something, Carol," I said softly. "You can't force people to care about what they're not ready to see. You can only make sure they're not alone when they finally do." She didn't answer, just turned and walked away. The moon was rising soft and pale above the shattered rooftops. For the first time in weeks, the air smelled clean. I stood there for a long time, letting it wash over me. The wind was back, but this time, it didn't carry fear. It carried change. It was the first time I'd been inside City Hall in over a decade. The wood-paneled chambers still smelled like wax and old files. Rows of neatly aligned chairs faced the elevated council desk, where 5 elected officials sat beneath the municipal seal of Tulsa. There were cameras at the back, press badges clipped to belts, and a quiet tension that filled every corner of the room like the scent of rain before a storm. I wore a dark gray shirt and brought nothing but a manila folder, already labeled and tabbed. The emergency hearing had been called under public safety protocols. The topic: review of regulatory and structural oversight failures by the Maple Hollow Homeowners Association. I didn't need to be there, but I had been invited as a key witness. And more than that, I needed to be there. For my neighbors. For every warning I had given and every silence I had endured. The session opened with a statement from Councilwoman Trina Farley. "We are here today not just to examine the aftermath of a weather disaster," she said, voice clear and steady, "but to determine how negligence, abuse of authority, and disregard for public safety may have amplified that disaster. We will hear testimony from resident safety experts and enforcement personnel." They called Carol first. She walked up to the podium in a blazer too sharp for the moment, shoulders back, jaw set like she was entering a courtroom drama she still believed she could win. Her voice, however, betrayed her. "I've always served the Maple Hollow community with dedication." She began, her tone defensive. "Yes, we were hit by a tornado. No, I'm not a meteorologist. I relied on the information available to us. Our intent was never to mislead." Councilwoman Farley cut in. "Ms. Whitmore, were you aware that your HOA issued emails directly contradicted National Weather Service tornado warnings?" Carol faltered. "I was attempting to reduce panic. We didn't want hysteria to spread. And were you aware that your clubhouse structure had failed final inspection, that it lacked the required wind resistance reinforcements?" A visible twitch in her jaw. "There was a misunderstanding with the contractor. I trusted the project was completed." Farley leaned forward. "Did you verify it yourself? I'm not an engineer." Carol snapped louder than she meant to. The room shifted. Murmurs spread. And yet Farley said, calm as a scalpel, "You had no problem overriding advice from one." "They called me next. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't need one. I simply walked up to the microphone, placed my folder on the stand, and opened to the first tab. 'My name is Hank Myers,' I began, and I moved into Maple Hollow 3 years ago. Before that, I worked 30 years in structural safety, specializing in storm mitigation and public risk assessments." I held up the first page, a copy of the HOA's violation notice against my storm shutters. "This is what I received when I tried to prepare for a tornado." I turned the page. "This is a copy of the inspection report the HOA ignored when they opened the community clubhouse without required reinforcements." Another page. "And this is a map showing the drainage system Carol Whitmore and the HOA board illegally paved over, increasing the risk of floodwater saturation and foundation collapse." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize. I let the truth carry its own weight. Councilman Harris leaned in. "Mr. Myers, did the HOA ever acknowledge your concerns? Respond to your safety assessments only with fines and public shaming?" I said. "Did you report any of this before the tornado?" I did. Repeatedly. To the board. Through emails. At meetings. I even offered to host a free community preparedness seminar. I was dismissed every time. Councilwoman Farley exchanged a glance with the city attorney. Then she leaned toward me. "Mr. Myers, in your professional opinion, could the damage to the clubhouse and surrounding homes have been mitigated?" "Yes," I answered without hesitation. "Absolutely." There was a long silence. The gavel sounded gently. "Thank you, Mr. Myers. Please remain available for further questions." I stepped down. The room felt smaller than it had when I arrived. Or maybe it was just the weight of reality, finally pressing into everyone's shoulders. Next came testimonies from residents. Natalie Delgado recounted the fines for planting an unauthorized emergency garden. Vic described being told to remove his solar generator because it disrupted the neighborhood energy aesthetic. Others spoke about withheld approvals for storm shelters, gag orders on community messaging apps, threats of legal action for speaking out. The council listened to all of it. When they reconvened after a short recess, their statement was swift and unsparing. Effective immediately, Councilwoman Farley said the Maple Hollow Homeowners Association is suspended from all operational duties pending legal review. A state receiver will be appointed to oversee neighborhood governance. Ms. Carol Whitmore is hereby referred to the district attorney for investigation into gross negligence and endangerment. You could have heard a pin drop. I looked across the aisle and saw Carol Ashen shaking. Her lawyer whispered something, but she didn't seem to hear him. For the first time, she looked small. Not defeated, not humiliated. Just small. Human. I didn't feel triumphant, but I felt the shift. As I left City Hall residence, I barely knew patted me on the back. Someone handed me a coffee. One man I recognized vaguely from the HOA's lawn care subcommittee looked at me with tearful eyes and simply said, "Thank you for all of it." Back home, I stood in front of the house and took in the battered siding, the small section of roof tarped, and waited with sandbags. It had held. Not because it was perfect, because it was prepared. That night, I returned to the green where the clubhouse had once stood. It was just an empty patch now surrounded by orange fencing and a weather-warped sign that still read, "Welcome to Maple Hollow, where order is beauty." Someone had spray-painted over order and replaced it with honor. I didn't laugh. I just nodded. Then I pulled a folded paper from my pocket and thumbtacked it to the fence. It was my old seminar flyer, the one the HOA never let me distribute. Disaster Resilience for Suburban Homes, How to Prepare Not Panic. Beneath it I scribbled in fresh ink, "Free to all. Saturday at 10 a.m. Bring questions. Hank Myers." The wind picked up gentle this time. No sirens, no screaming, just air. Clean and free. The first official day without Carol felt like waking up after a long illness. The air in Maple Hollow was lighter, somehow easier to breathe. The absence of her voice, her directives, her watchful patrols. It was a silence filled not with fear, but with relief. It was like the neighborhood had exhaled, and yet, in the quiet came reckoning. The temporary state receiver, a former city manager named Paul Langley, moved into a small rented trailer at the end of the cul-de-sac and began his review. He was calm, practical, and utterly immune to theatrics. I met him on his first morning coffee in hand, as he stood outside the trailer surveying a stack of old HOA files someone had reluctantly handed over. "You must be the one everyone's been talking about," he said, extending a hand. "Hank Myers, engineer, retired." "Kind of," he smiled. "I've already reviewed your documentation. It's the most thorough civilian case file I've ever seen." I gave a half shrug. Habit. Over the next few days, Paul and his team interviewed residents, reviewed citations, photographed damaged lots, and cross-referenced every violation ever issued under Carol's board. The numbers were staggering. Over 350 citations had been issued in the past 18 months alone. More than 40% were for infractions unrelated to safety or structural compliance. Dozens of residents had paid fines under threat of lien placements, some for things as petty as placing a garden gnome 2 inches too far from their flower bed. It was a tyranny of taste disguised as governance. Meanwhile, Carol had vanished. Her house sat dark and untouched, curtains, drawn mailbox full. The car was gone. No one had seen her since the emergency hearing. The rumor mill said she'd checked into a hotel in Tulsa, under a different name, possibly lawyering up for an impending civil suit. But the town wasn't waiting on her anymore. Saturday arrived bright and clear for my first open seminar. I brought 3 folding tables, set them up near the playground skeleton, and arranged handouts, laminated diagrams of proper shelter construction, storm prep checklists, wind-resistant landscaping guidelines. I expected maybe 10 people. By 10:10 a.m., there were over 50. Families brought lawn chairs and notebooks. Retirees came with questions written on legal pads. A young couple from 2 streets over brought their laptop and asked if they could film the session. "Sure," I said. Might as well teach something useful while I still have a voice. For the next 2 hours, I walked them through every lesson I'd learned, what worked, what failed, what saved lives. I showed them how to fortify garage doors with minimal cost, how to maintain an emergency radio log, how to identify structural weak points in their homes. I didn't dumb anything down. I didn't make it scary. I made it real. Afterward, people lingered. They asked if we could make it a monthly thing. Someone suggested forming a volunteer emergency watch. Another offered to donate an old shed to convert into a weather hub. I agreed to all of it. And when the last person left, I packed up in silence, heart full. The HOA hadn't just failed in its duty. It had failed to see what community could truly be. Now out of the wreckage, that community was building itself brick by honest brick. 3 days later, I got a call from the state attorney's office. Mr. Myers, this is investigator Lena Cook. We'd like to discuss your involvement in a potential class action suit regarding the HOA's actions prior to the tornado. I'm happy to cooperate, I said. We're also investigating misuse of HOA funds and false enforcement under municipal pertinence. That one gave me pause. What does that mean exactly? She replied, we have reason to believe Ms. Whitmore may have been issuing fines under legal citations that had no municipal backing, essentially inventing her own regulations. I closed my eyes. Of course, the queen bee hadn't just been tyrannical. She'd been fraudulent. I provided them with access to all my files, emails, letters. The video of Carol admitting to calming panic by overriding NWS alerts. Every note I'd taken now had the weight of evidence. Truth was finally being weaponized, not in anger, but in justice. 2 weeks later, an article dropped in the Sunday edition of the Tulsa Gazette. Storm of Control: The Collapse of Maple Hollow's HOA Empire. It featured Carol's photo taken mid-speech at a board meeting, mouth open, hand raised, and contrasted it with images of the collapsed clubhouse, wounded residents, and my seminar in the park. They quoted me directly, emergency preparedness isn't about paranoia. It's about respect. Respect for nature, for your neighbors, and for the limits of control. That quote was shared more than 20,000 times online. Not because it was brilliant, because it was finally painfully obvious. That same day, Paul Langley delivered his preliminary recommendations for Maple Hollow's future governance. They were read aloud at a public meeting held at the library's community room. He stood at the front, clipboard in hand, and said, as of next month, the Maple Hollow HOA will be officially dissolved. All financial operations will be transitioned to a resident-led maintenance cooperative, with a capped budget, open elections, and rotating oversight. All safety and emergency protocols will be supervised in coordination with city emergency services. The new bylaws will include an honor over aesthetics clause, which prioritizes safety-related modifications above visual conformity. A ripple of applause followed. Paul added one more thing. I'd also like to recognize Mr. Hank Myers. Without his persistence, documentation, and unwillingness to be silenced, we might still be operating under dangerous illusions. I didn't stand. I didn't bow. I just tipped my head slightly, heart beating hard in my chest. It was never about me, but it had always been on me. As the meeting adjourned, I stepped outside into the parking lot and leaned against my truck. The wind was picking up again, dry, cool, not a threat, just a reminder. I stared at the neighborhood from that slight elevation, patched roofs, blue tarps flapping like flags of recovery, kids chasing one another across the green again, laughter where once there had been citations. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and it would hold. The mailbox was dented, the lawn still half torn from tire tracks left by utility trucks, and a corner shutter flapped on one hinge like a tired eye that refused to close. But to me, my house had never looked better. It wasn't because it survived the storm. It was because of what came after. For the first time since I moved to Maple Hollow, people waved without hesitation. Conversations didn't feel performative, like they were being logged somewhere by an invisible committee. Instead, they came with laughter, with offers of help, with thank you for what you did, said not out of obligation, but with sincerity. The physical rebuilding had begun, but the emotional one was well underway. 3 weeks after the dissolution of the HOA, the old clubhouse was finally demolished. Not just the broken frame left by the tornado, but the foundation, too. A crew came with jackhammers and excavators. Residents gathered to watch from a safe distance, many bringing lawn chairs like it was a community movie night. Someone even brought popcorn. The final beam came down to a smattering of applause. Then, without announcement or fanfare, 2 teenagers planted a small wooden sign at the edge of the lot. It read, "Future Site of the Maple Hollow Resilience Garden." I didn't know who built it. No committee had approved it. No board had signed off. And no one stopped them. That was the real victory. Later that day, I walked through the neighborhood with my usual checklist in hand. Except now it wasn't about violations or vulnerabilities. It was a list of households still without power, still in need of roofers, still waiting for FEMA assessment. I stopped by the Delgado house. Tom and Natalie greeted me with wide smiles. Their back patio had become a staging area for mutual aid boxes of canned goods, cases of water tarps, baby wipes. They called it the Hollow Hub. "We keep it stocked," Natalie said. "If anyone needs anything, they come here first." They weren't the only ones. Vic had opened his garage to start hosting weekly repair days. Retired contractors, electricians, and even a few high school students volunteered, rotating through homes in need. One week, they patched up a chimney. The next, they rebuilt a porch that had been blown apart. The neighborhood was healing itself. I was no longer the man people whispered about with skepticism. Now I was just Hank. That's what the kids called me when they passed by on bikes. "Hi, Hank." "Hey, Hank." Sometimes they waved before I even saw them. No longer the paranoid guy with the bunker, just the neighbor who didn't give up. One crisp Saturday morning, I woke up to find a folded letter in my mailbox. No envelope. Just a single sheet of thick stationery, my name, handwritten in a careful script. It was from Carol. "Hank, I watched your seminar on the news. I saw the community meeting. I read the report. I don't know if you'll believe this or if it matters, but I didn't do what I did because I wanted power. I did it because I thought if everything looked perfect, then nothing could go wrong. I didn't understand that control is not the same as safety. I'm leaving Tulsa. I'm staying with my sister for a while. The lawyers are handling the rest. I doubt I'll come back. But you should know that you were right. About all of it. I hope they let you build something better." Carol, I read it twice. Then I folded it again and placed it on the shelf above my desk next to the first violation notice I ever received. I didn't hate her. Not anymore. Maybe I never had. What I hated was what she represented: the need to preserve an illusion at the cost of truth, of safety, of human dignity. She hadn't been the only one trapped in that illusion. We all had been. Now we were free. Later that week, the city formally recognized our neighborhood as a model community for disaster resilience. They sent a plaque. It was small and modest, but it mattered. The mayor visited. She stood on the patch of land where the clubhouse once stood, now bare, and waiting for new roots. I introduced her to residents. She shook hands, gave a short speech, then handed me a framed certificate for Mr. Hank Myers, she said into the mic, whose quiet diligence, unwavering commitment to truth, and profound sense of duty helped not only save lives, but restore what community was always meant to be. I didn't say much, just stepped up, nodded, and said thank you. But I didn't do it alone, and I meant it. Because real safety doesn't come from steel bolts or shutters. It comes from trust, from being willing to speak up even when you're laughed at, from listening when it's uncomfortable, from helping someone fix their roof, not because you're told to, but because they're your neighbor. That spring, the Resilience Garden broke ground. Dozens came to help. We planted native trees, pollinator flowers, even set up a small tool shed with emergency supplies. The new signpost, carved from the salvaged frame of the old clubhouse, read, "In honor of those who prepare, those who rebuild, and those who stay." I stood back and watched it sway gently in the wind. The same wind that once brought fear now rustled through fresh leaves and laughter. I still keep my shutters up. I still check the radio weekly, but I don't feel like I'm doing it alone anymore. I feel seen. I feel heard. And for the first time in a long time, I feel safe.